itself. And Ali Khan is a historian. For those who, I just want to read a brief bio of Ali Khan. Ali Khan is an academic, a columnist, a public speaker, and he specializes in a wide range of subjects involving political, religious, security-related issues in South Asia, as well as the greater part of West Asia, that is the Middle East, as they call it in America. He is currently assistant professor of history and political science at the Ashoka University, Sonpet. He writes a fortnightly column for the Urdu daily The Inqilab, apart from also regularly contributing to English and Hindi print and online publications. This book is a recent publication by the Oxford University Press, and I was just going through it. It's a wonderful book, and the Urdu is just amazing. I think I can see that Ali's love for Urdu just come through it. It's such a wonderful book, and in the context, see, it talks about a period from between 1850 to 1950, just before the so-called Sepoy Mutiny, or to some the first war of independence in 1857. Muslims were suspected. Yeah, I think the host, perhaps all should be. No, Ali, if it is about the noise is coming from my end, my apologies. I'll mute after some time because there are some crackers being burst outside my house. I don't know for what occasion we have crossed Diwali, and yet I can hear some crackers being burst outside my house. So the noise is from my side. You'll have to. So I think I'll quickly go through this and hand it over to you and mute and then mute myself. As I said, this book talks about how Muslims negotiated their identity, because in 1857, especially after 1857, the British suspected their loyalty, and a lot of violence took place against them. A lot of Muslims were hanged, and it was thought that they were behind the. Of course, they were in a sense behind the 1857 events, and widespread violence took place against them by the British, and that was when the loyalty was suspect before Sir Syed Ahmad Khan came and completely to change things to some extent by siding with the British, or at least trying to neutralize the effect. But and in a similar sense, the Muslims are going through what they went through in 1857. I mean, once again, today their loyalty is being suspected. Whenever something happens, Muslims are asked to go to Pakistan. I mean, as though that's the only solution left. So how do we negotiate today, and what role did Urdu, especially Urdu poetry and the Mushaira itself, the site of Urdu poetry, where the poetry recited and both romantic and political statements are made through the Mushairas, as we all know. So this is what the book is all about. And it also talks about the idea of the nation, whether it is, I mean, it talks about Watan or Qawm, and how do we negotiate the idea of nation itself? How do we define it? A lot of things, that was a very crucial period in Indian history, 1850 to 1950. I mean, just when just after India got independence, a lot happened at that time. So this is what is always going to be about. And the format of today's talk is Ali will speak for about half an hour or 40 minutes. I mean, however long he wants to, and then I and Ali will have a brief conversation about his book for about 15 minutes, and then we open it up to Q&A for about 45 minutes. So this is our format, and I thank everybody for being here, especially Ali for taking his time out. I know he's a very busy person. For those who don't know, he's also the grandson of the famous Raja of Mahmudabad, I mean, who was one of the financial backbones to Jinnah and his Muslim League at the time. So he comes from a very historical, background and a historic personality, in fact. So, but he in his own right, he's a great scholar. He also is a politician in a sense. He's part of a political party. He actually wears so many hats. I don't know how he manages, but he does it. So thanks a lot for being here, Ali, and I just hand it over to you now. Please carry on. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Faizur Rahman Saab. Good evening to everyone. Pranam and salam.
I'll meet.
as well. Thank you for those kind words. Not sure, उर्दू में कहते हैं कि किसी को टोपी पहनाना, तो कम से कम मैं अपने को खुद को टोपी पहनाता हूँ, दूसरों को टोपी नहीं पहनाता हूँ अब तक के। तो ये है कि बहरहाल the joke will be lost in English. So, but to make a fool out of someone in Urdu is to make them wear a hat. And at least I only make myself wear various topis, and so at least I'm not a danger to anyone else yet. Well, thank you so much for having me here and for giving me this chance to speak about my book, which came out earlier this year, and for which I was very proud to launch at Shaheen Bagh at the hands of Bilqis Banu, the famous Dadi or Nani, if you like. The Nanis are often forgotten. Dadis they're always called Dadis, but I'm sure they're also Nanis. So of Shaheen Bagh, and it was an honor for me to be able to do that, because of course we are passing through a time during which these questions of belonging, particularly amongst Muslims, are coming up because of the political situation in India, but also the social situation. But of course, my work is much precedes the current period. For those of you who aren't aware, this is being recorded, so eventually your questions will also, I presume, be recorded. So I thought what I will do is I will actually not speak for 40 minutes. I'll speak for about 25 to 30 minutes so that we can have a conversation, Faizur Rahman Saab, and then perhaps if there are questions from the audience, I think those are always more interesting, and I'd be very happy to field questions on, if anyone has read the book, to talk about some of the shortcomings, in my opinion, and how further work could be done on this topic. So the question that I really began to think about when I was beginning this research project, which was originally my PhD, was the question of the public sphere. Now, of course, for those of you who are familiar with academics or academia, Jürgen Habermas is the great German scholar. His work on the public sphere is seminal in order to understand notions of the public sphere in Europe. But often very lazily, we sort of draw an equivalence in post-colonial societies and think about the public sphere in a similar way to the manner in which we imagine it in the so-called West, at least in Western Europe and North America. And I was very interested in these spaces, these pre-modern spaces in the subcontinent, in particular in India, spaces such as the Mushaira, which is the Poetic Symposium, other spaces which I haven't been able to look at in this work in particular are temple spaces, dargah spaces, sacred shrines, Muharram processions, which are liminal, of course, in their nature, that they only occur during a part of the year, but they provide a very interesting public space in which various kind of communities engage with each other, and so on and so forth. And of course, we tend to think about and reduce these spaces either to a religious space or fundamentally, for example, the Mushaira, because poetry is recited in the Mushaira, as a space of literature. And we forget, of course, that in a country like India, these are also constitutive of political spaces. And so, if I may, I'll work backwards from my date, 1850 to 1950, because one of the questions that, of course, Ambedkar raises post the framing of the Constitution, and when it's coming up for ratification, and he says that the problem he foresees is that an authoritarian leader might emerge on the back of this very Constitution, which has such wonderful values and progressive values, if India does not go through a social revolution. And I think this is something that we take very lightly, because of course India did not experience the social change that was also part of the Enlightenment, in terms of the ideas that informed and emerged out of the Enlightenment in Europe were also found and made for themselves a space in the public sphere, as it is known in Europe, through the newspaper, through print, through operas, through public squares, squares, through cafes, through salons, and so on and so forth. Um, and of course, these ideas, in post-extra-European societies, particularly in societies which were colonized and then obtained at some point their independence, the political revolution preceded the social revolution. In fact, society did not go through the social churn, and I suppose that is partly what is happening right now. So I was particularly interested, as a part of this space, the space of the Mushaira, I was interested in seeing what changes and transformations it went through over the course of this 100 years, and whether it was used by people in order to adapt to the new social, political, cultural, linguistic exigencies that were faced by people in South Asia once they were formally under the rule of the British Crown. So the book is divided. So these are some of the questions that, and I've sort of skirted over it, but these are some of the questions that animated my quest. The desire to locate how people were imagining and articulating a sense of belonging and rootedness, using structures and forms that were not, as Partha Chatterjee puts it, well, they were not derivative in any way, but rather were products of a culture that had developed here and then, of course, adapted itself. And I'll speak about that more in a second. So the book is divided basically into these two parts. One half of it is a history of the Mushaira as a public space over really the 18th century. As any historian, I claim that I work from the 1850 to 1950, but actually I cheat. And in my first chapter, I begin in the 18th century, but I don't include that in my title. So it's not to scare people and also not to try to claim that I'm doing too much. So one half of the book is about the history of the Mushaira. And the second half of the book is about ideas and articulations of belonging. This theme, which could loosely be called Hubbe Watani, which is a form of patriotism, but of course, Hub, the Arabic word, which is also used in Urdu, love, and particularly in the context of Urdu poetry, has a very interesting sort of role to play, where older forms of poetry often were either put aside or co-opted in order to articulate new senses of belonging. So half the book is a history of the Mushaira, and half the book is an effort to try and chart the manner in which people over this 100-year period articulated not only a sense of belonging, but also sort of tried to articulate a sense of India, or what they imagined India to be. And of course, this is the question that is still very important. It's in a sense, the million-dollar question in India is, what does India mean to Muslims? Of course, Muslims in India are a tremendously diverse community, not in terms of community, in terms of sect, but also in terms of language. So I particularly look at Urdu-speaking North Indian Muslims, that too of a particular sort of class background, as it happens. And so that, it would be another work perhaps that would be interesting, would be to also see people from different socioeconomic backgrounds also, the kind of poetry that they produced, but that's something we can discuss at the end. So the Mushaira is the formal space in which poetry is recited. You have accounts in 18th century tazkiras or biographies and compilations of poets about mushairas that were held and patronized by the court, but also mushairas that were held in people's houses. And basically, as Shamsur Rahman Farooqi puts it, the great Urdu scholar who has been battling COVID as it happens, as well as, unfortunately, cancer in these last days. He was in hospital, and send a prayer for him to recover. So he calls the Mushaira a technical workshop. And really, that's what it is. It's a technical workshop in which poets hone their craft, they address each other. The structural form of the Mushaira is a circle all the way up, really until it opens up in the late 19th century. And the themes of the Mushaira are metaphysical themes, themes that draw from tasawwuf, from what one is popularly known as Sufism. And therefore the tropes and the themes and the metaphors and the vocabulary and the idiom that animate this language is one of love and longing and separation from the beloved. And the ghazal, of course, is the form in which this is articulated. And here, a brief caveat about the ghazal. I mean, for me, the ghazal is really an extraordinary vehicle through which one can begin to understand, the genius of Islamic civilizations as a literary form. It predates Islam to the time of the so-called Jahiliyyah, which is how Muslims call the era before the formal revelation of the Quran. And of course, amongst Arabs, orality and poetry in particular were highly valued. And then the ghazal travels, it travels out of the Arabian Peninsula towards Turkey, to Iran. I'm sorry, someone's mic seems to be on, so if I may just ask you to mute. So the ghazal travels as a form, and it's very highly regimented. It's got its own set of very strict rules to do with meter and cadence, a bit like formal English poetry, like iambic pentameter and dactylic hexameter. So the rules are very fixed, the meters are very fixed, and these carry over to Turkish, to Persian, to Urdu. And what's very interesting is that, of course, the vocabulary in all of these languages travels across cultures. And this is a very interesting aspect, of course, because in a sense, you don't have to translate these terms which are embedded in these Islamic cultures, which is why, in my own personal and humble opinion, a ghazal in English is almost impossible, because you cannot use that vocabulary that taps into these themes that and these images of the garden, of the nightingale, of the wine, which straddle and carry within them embedded allusions to an Islamic history across cultures and civilizations. So the Mushaira is really a technical workshop to hone the ghazal. And what happens in the 19th century, once the British come, is that one of the critiques of the British, of course, is that this culture of the Mushaira, of the ghazal, is a hedonistic culture. And unfortunately also, Muslims in a certain sense internalized this critique, perhaps sometimes uncritically. And so the British, particularly through organizations like the Anjuman-e-Punjab, which was founded in, I believe, 1864 by Major William Holroyd and Dr. Leitner, they encouraged mushairas. They actually formally patronized mushairas, in which they encouraged the use of natural themes. So Barkharat, for example, monsoon, one of the themes that they gave was Hubbi Watani, patriotism. And so what you see is that they use the kind of space of the mushaira as a vehicle through which to propagate their own ideas about what the work that poetry and literature should be doing. And of course, the two people who are most famously associated with this are Altaf Hussain Hali and Muhammad Hussain Azad. And they begin writing these poetry, not of course in the ghazal form, but in the nazm form. So the nazm is very different from the ghazal because it is more, it is much less defined as a form. And it mimics, it's something closer to the English free verse, unlike sonnets, for instance, which are highly structured. And the nazm as a form then escapes the formality of the ghazal, and people start using, writing about the monsoon, about geography, about mountains, about rivers, about patriotism. And the mushaira also undergoes a structural transformation from this circle, and it opens up and now includes an audience. And of course, this is a key difference and change that takes place, because of course the opening up of the circle also means, it's a kind of democratization of the space, a democratization that is lamented by a lot of the senior poets, because they're no longer addressing each other, but they're addressing an audience. And of course, the audience tastes partly begin to dictate now what is popular and what should be recited. And so, according to all accounts, there's a drop in the quality of poetry, and various kinds of then musharas take place. So you have the neem sarkari, the sort of semi-government, semi-official mushaira. You have the official mushaira, the sarkari mushaira. You have the munazima, which is in which you only recite nazms, and so on and so forth. One of the interesting forms that takes root at the beginning of the the 20th century, in the first quarter, is the tamsili mushaira, the acted mushaira. And these are fascinating because before a real mushaira, what people would do is they would dress up as the poets of the last great poets of the Mughal days. And they would act out tamsili, an acted mushaira, a tamsili mushaira, and they would act out these roles, which is that represent the sort of apotheosis or the high point of Urdu literary culture as was imagined by them. And then, of course, they would get into the real mushaira. And the mushairas, there were literary organizations formed. They were in competition with each other. Political parties towards the 30s start hosting mushairas. Interestingly, I didn't find any account of the Muslim League hosting a mushaira, although I spoke to Chaudhry Muhammad Naeem of Chicago and Professor Francis Pritchett in Columbia and many others, Khwaja Zakaria in Pakistan. And we don't find any official account of this, but the Congress, the Communist Party, the Progressive Writers Movement, all of these patronize mushairas. The British patronize mushairas. And there's almost a circuit which these poets inhabit, in which they move around. And of course, it's often the same poets that go around, from the Congress one to the Progressive Writers one to the ones held and patronized by literary organizations. So the mushaira undergoes this structural transformation. It includes the audience, and the other change that takes place is the candle, which was used, passed around that circle, is now replaced by the loudspeaker. And so we have very interesting accounts. Unfortunately, there's no time to go into details of the manner in which the loudspeaker and this technology of amplification disrupt this particular space, and how people, of course, try and hijack, the mic or the loudspeaker or the wires, fiddle with them in order to put off the poet. And of course, the Post and the Telegraph also increase, in a sense, the audience. So beyond the physical audience of the mushaira, women in particular, for instance, write in and send poetry through the post, not only to poets for their correction, for islah, but also to be recited at mushairas. They participate in mushairas by the beginning of the 20th century, and therefore special parda arrangements are made for women, which of course also affects the structural aspect of the mushaira. And so the mushaira, in a sense, I have really sort of skipped a lot of the detail, which made this project for me very interesting to explore. But from the small towns of Ambala, Hoshiarpur, Khairabad, Allahabad, Faizabad, Jaunpur, Barabanki, etc., to the bigger towns of Delhi, Shimla, Karachi, Lucknow, Hyderabad, Rampur. There was this entire sort of network existed, which was inhabited by poets and their students. The Ustad Shagird, the poet, the teacher-student relationship was very important, because of course people linked themselves genealogically almost to a particular school and to a particular person. So, for example, Dar Dehlavi, one of the important poets at the end of the beginning of the 20th century, is one of the very important poets who has a huge number of students, including, for example, Pandit Josh Malsiani, who wrote down a memoir called Loho Qalam, which was one of my primary sources, which is an account of 11 mushairas, and it really provides a very fascinating kind of granular detail of the manner in which these mushairas were conducted. So this is largely and broadly speaking, the first half of the book is charting these changes in the space of the mushaira, how print, ease of travel, technology, the colonial education department, and so on and so forth. All of these had an effect on the structure of the mushaira. And of course, in a culture that prized orality, and remember that much like poetry in any other language, poetry is not written to be read to oneself, but to be heard. And that is, of course, what represents, in a sense, the genius of poetry, because at the moment of the uttering of the word, there is an almost immediate sort of reaction by the audience, who each of them, of course, interpret that particular verse in their own way. And the genius of the poet is to be able to speak to the largest number of people with just one couplet. So I don't want to dwell too much on this first half of the book, the structural changes in the mushaira, but nonetheless, of course, I hope it's evident to you now that it's a very important space, and it undergoes these structural transformations, and those transformations, of course, reflect the changing economic, political, social, cultural, and linguistic, of course, exigencies that everyone in North India faced. Now, of course, the last thing that I will say is, I think the mushaira, it represented a kind of a left, it carries within it a memory of a pre-capitalist sense of time, a non-linear sense of time. And I think that's very important, because it sort of fundamentally interrogates, ideas of productivity, ideas of the manner in which we tend to view these, even the public sphere, as doing the work of creating a public. The mushaira, I think, is a much more sophisticated space. Because it is not seeking to create any kind of homogeneity, it is not seeking to create any kind of uniformity. But the genius, of course, of the poetry is that the themes of the mushaira is what links the audience together, and also the poets to the poets. Now, coming to the second half of the book, what I try and do is using various forms, in other words, trying to use poetry as a historical archive. I try and chart out the manner in which North Indian Muslims imagined India. And largely speaking, if I was to sum up my argument in one sentence, that's always dangerous, but you can perhaps question me on it later. The argument is something like this, that up until the late 19th century, Muslims in particular were able to articulate a sense of belonging in India, and indeed an imagining of India that was metaphysical, which linked India almost spiritually to the wider geography of the Muslim world. And of course, there are examples I give of poems that do this work of creating this kind of cartography which collapses the space between the Kaaba, for instance, and the alleys of Delhi. And so it moves from this metaphysical articulation of India to a material articulation, which is what, of course, the nation or the nascent idea of nationality demands, is that you conceive of, imagine, and define the nation according to very sort of material anchors, if you like. And remember, going back to that period on the mushaira, the British, the themes that they gave for the mushaira were natural so-called themes. They wanted people to write about geography, to write about rivers and mountains, to write about patriotism, to write about the things that made India, the physical things, the material aspects of India. And of course, this is where there is a wide divergence, because as soon as you begin to sort of define India in terms of geography, in terms of a physical geography rather than a sort of spiritual geography, inevitably there is going to be a difference in the manner in which different communities define and articulate their sense of India. And in my opinion, of course, I only go up until 1950. Even even despite this change that is in part catalyzed by the arrival of the imperial, the imperial and colonial powers, which, let's not forget, bring with them a new vocabulary. It's not just about power, it's not just about economic relations, but also the language of the nation state, the language of citizenship, the language of patriotism, what we now call political science, which later in Urdu is termed ulum-e-siyasi. The colonial structures of knowledge also, privilege, which of course are privileged normatively by the colonial state and by the education department and by the government, etc. These also fundamentally catalyze this shift from the metaphysical to the material. And let's not forget, as I said earlier, the metaphysical is simply dismissed as hedonistic, right? These poets writing about love, writing about the candle and the moth, or the inn and the innkeeper, the garden and the nightingale, the rose, all of these things are fundamentally sort of hedonistic. They are to be avoided. They come in the way of progress. And what we need is natural subjects. And the nazm, of course, is encouraged as the vehicle for this change to take place. And so, for example, one of the very early pre-modern poets who used the nazm form is Nazir Akbar Abadi. But then later on in the 19th century, that's in the 18th century, but by the 19th and early 20th century, for example, Ismail Merathi, Muhammad Hussain Azad, Altaf Hussain Hali, and a lot of these other poets use the nazm in order to articulate a language of political belonging. And so one point I'll make here is that we often forget that the vocabulary that is used in order to define, for example, community, qawm, which is a very notoriously ambiguous word. It can refer to a religious community, it can refer to a political community, it can refer to a sort of a fraternity. This vocabulary, in a sense, the arrival of colonial forms of knowledge catalyzed the creation of a new set of vocabulary, and not just a new set of vocabulary, but also often people use transliterated words from English into Urdu. इस पीछे मजहबी में है यकता, इस पीछे मजहबी में भी यकता है शेख कैंप. Is speech, and Akbar al-Abadi is using speech deliberately in order to satirize the manner in which people, and of course Akbar al-Abadi criticized Sayyid Ahmad Khan, who Faizur Rahman Saab mentioned, as someone who was working as just for the British. But there's a co-option, there's a transliteration that takes place that is very interesting, and there is a creation of vocabulary. So, and not just in Urdu, but in Persian, in Arabic, in Turkish. So, for instance, in Turkish, the word for citizen is vatandas. In Arabic, it is mawatin, from the root watan. So it's to do with watan, meaning homeland. In Farsi, it's shahrvand. Again, tied to the idea of the city, interestingly different from Arabic. In Urdu, it is shahri, again tied to the idea of the city, and Hindi, nagrik, of course, nagar. So again, the tying it to this idea of the inhabitant of the city. But these are neologisms, right? And of course, it's not just ideas of citizenship, but also ideas of patriotism, the manner in which political organization is conceived of, because of course, the big question that is animating the thought of a lot of the writers that I explore in this book, and a lot of writers otherwise also in different communities in different parts of the world, is what happened, right? Muslims are asking this question in the 19th century from North Africa all the way to South Asia and beyond. And what happened, of course, alludes to the loss of political power. And part of the response to this is to think that the manner to catch up with the West, for the rest to catch up with the West, is to see the manner in which the West, the so-called West, in inverted commas, has organized itself, ideas of scientific rationality, ideas of bureaucracy, the ideas of the nation state itself, and the rational organization of society. And these are some of the challenges that these people set themselves. And of course, they're all working in the context of a colonial state that is gradually narrowing down and focusing identity in the modern meaning of the world by things such as the census, which seek to use labels, ascriptive labels, and seek to categorize communities according to language, according to religion, and so on and so forth, which of course, once you officially recognize those, you're fixing identities in a certain sense, and the fuzziness of identity, as Sudipta Kaviraj calls it, is lost. So all of this is to say that, you know, the poets in the time that I'm writing are grappling with this new and shifting landscape of vocabulary. And this is not just something that begins with the advent of the British, but in the 18th century, when Nadir Shah and Ahmad Shah Abdali invade Delhi, there is a migration out of Delhi of poets and others who go to various other centers. They go to Rajasthan, they come to Rampur, to Lucknow, to Hyderabad. And these people write this poetry called Sheher Ashob, which is, again, a genre of poetry, like the ghazal, like the nazm. And the Sheher Ashob, literally, which means the lament or the affliction of the city, in a sense, captures the way in which a certain sort of elite class of poets in particular lament the ruin that was inflicted upon Delhi by these invasions. So what's very interesting is, of course, you know, if you take that as a beginning point, Muslims invading other, you know, a seat of Muslim power, then religion, of course, in the sense in which we see it, is put aside. And of course, the dynamics of power and so on are what we need to understand in order to see why Delhi was invaded and at whose behest Delhi was invaded. But nonetheless, this poetry that is produced articulates this strong sense of loss and nostalgia for the city, for Delhi as it was laid waste. And then Sheher Ashobs are subsequently written for other cities in the 19th century. And someone like Shibli Nomani begins to write the Qawmi Sheher Ashob. So what's very interesting is the Sheher Ashob goes from the 18th century, lament about the loss of a city, the destruction of a city, to the Qawmi Musaddas, the Qawmi Sheher Ashob, which is a lament of the community. And of course, again, here you see the creeping in of this new idea of political community, the Qawm being used to deploy and to put forward a notion of a political community rather than a religious community. And of course, the inbuilt ambiguity of the word Qawm makes it very useful for poets to build in a sort of ambiguity, as it were, to the poetry. And so the Sheher Ashob capture this moment. And then in the 19th century, as the British patronize these mushairas, people like Altaf Hussain Hali from Muhammad Hussain Assad start writing about community, start writing about Hindus and Muslims, sheikhs and sayyids, Brahman and Maulvi, a kind of new vocabulary, because of course, remember that the ghazal, even though it was often highly political, but it was always camouflaged in the language that is formally associated with mysticism. So the ghazal did not lend itself to this kind of overt form of politics that the nazm allows for. And so people start articulating, ideas of belonging, of selfhood, that try and incorporate these older ideas of India as a spiritual homeland, India as a land of shrines, as a land of saints, the shrines being part of a sacred cartography that links India to the Kaaba, to the other holy places, to Medina. And people start writing about it in terms of, a modern vocabulary of political belonging, and you see for example, I brought out, I'll read the translation in the question and answer. I can read the original. But Hali, for instance, writes, "Why do you sit without a worry, O compatriots? Get up, become friends with each other and your compatriots, Ahle Watan. Whether they are Muslim or Hindu, whether their religion is Buddhist or Brahmin, whether they are Shia or Sunni, whether they are Jain or Vaishnavi, see everyone with a loving gaze, see everyone as the apple of your eye. Countries are free by sheer chance, cities are inhabited by chance. If India, was bound by concordance, why would we suffer under strangers? When nations lose their unity, they forsake all their wealth." Qawm, jab ittifaq, qawm is the word that is used here. So this is a very sort of material understanding of India as inhabited by these various communities that need to reach a compact with each other in order to sort of be able to throw out the British, the latest, the invaders. And what is very interesting in this poetry is an attempt also to engage with what is becoming more and more contested, a contested history of Muslims in India. So, for instance, in Mukalame Saif o Qalam, which is by Ismail Merathi, the conversation between a sword and a pen, the pen lambasts the sword for laying waste to the temple of Somnath, for instance. And Shibli Nomani also, tries to say and distance himself from what is being portrayed, and today, of course, these questions are highly important in 2020 because it is the sort of real and imagined wrongs of so-called Muslims as a homogeneous unit over 1,000 years for which people are being held accountable today. But even in the late 19th century, early 20th century, these poets are engaging with what they see to be a fraught relationship, and they want to distance themselves from these acts of vandalism, from destruction. They want to sort of argue that this is not Islamic, this is not part of Muslim history, but this should be seen as a political act. And of course, this is a new form of subjectivity, a new form of political subjectivity that is emerging at this time. And the other thing, of course, and this is the last thing I'll say before maybe we can go into one of the we can talk about later is the other change that is taking place at this particular time is an increased understanding of a broader Muslim community, which is today known as the Ummah or the Millat. In pre-modern times, of course, a lot of these Muslim so-called empires were at war with each other. So, of course, the Ummah as a conceptual category plays a very different role in the pre-modern period to the modern period. But under the yoke of colonialism, and of course, because of the possibility of increased transport, Muslims are going to Europe, they're going to other parts of the Arab world, and of course, news is traveling. And so there's this new sort of awareness of the Muslims as a transnational political community, not just a religious fraternity, but a transnational political community, Ummah, or the Millat, the Ummah being a kind of spiritual community, the Millat being a sort of the political community, but also has religious, of course, undertones. And, so what Muslims begin to grapple with is, of course, articulating a sense of India, but also finding common cause with Muslims in Palestine, Muslims in Libya, and Muslims in Lebanon, and imagining, the community of Muslims worldwide to be besieged. And I think this is very important. This is a very important change that takes place because people then, of course, have to negotiate these various spheres of belonging, the local, the regional, the national, not in the nation, sense of the national nation state, but the national in terms of a political community, and then of course the transnational. And these multiple overlapping spheres of belonging give rise to a very interesting and new set of articulations about belonging. And of course, the vexed question, and the question that is still being asked in America, it is still being asked in Europe, not still, but it is being asked in Europe and America, but has been asked in India and in other parts of the world, is, are Muslims loyal to this transnational community or to the nation state? And I think the answer lies in exploring the history before of this part of the world, even before the nation state formally comes into existence, because these poets were able to come to an articulation which didn't see these identities as overlapping, as contradictory, but as actually reinforcing each other. And very interestingly, Jamaluddin Afghani, who some of you might be familiar with, who is associated with this pan-Islamism, makes a very interesting, in a letter to the Caliph of Turkey at the time, he's going off on a sort of an international mission to preach the way of pan-Islamism. He makes a very interesting exception for India, and he says, actually, I'm not going to preach this cause of pan-Islamism in India because there I can see a linguistic unity emerging between Hindus and Muslims. Of course, these are the two categories that he sees and broadly generalizes the communities of India into. But it's very interesting nonetheless that Jamaluddin Afghani sees India as almost exceptional in this sense. And he says, actually, the unity that can be derived is from Hindustani. And of course, this is where, coming back to my main point, the Mushaira facilitated the interaction of people from different communities. Urdu as a language was spoken by different communities. The script was absent from the Mushaira. It's an oral space. So all the arguments that take place about Devanagari or Nastaliq, in other words, writing Hindustani in Persian script or Hindi script, are absent entirely. And therefore, the Mushaira becomes, I think, a very popular medium through which to promote these ideas of nationalism, of anti-colonial struggle. The Congress Party uses the Mushaira in 1936 in order to kick off its political campaign. And so, going back to this idea of India almost being this exceptional case where Hindustani at least was thought of by someone like Jamaluddin Afghani as being a language, of course, at that time spoken by elites, but nonetheless elites that came from different communities who had a common language and therefore had a common basis for unity, is a very interesting point. The other, of course, imagining that this that briefly comes into the picture, which Hasrat Mohani, the person who coined the term Inqilab Zindabad, a real maverick. He was a part of the Muslim League. He was a part of the Congress Party. He was a founder of the Communist Party. He was the only member of the Constituent Assembly not to ratify the constitution, to which Panditji was very upset and said, Maulana, you will leave a stain on the history books. And he said, this is not a pro-poor, pro-minority constitution, and therefore I will not ratify it. And he dissented. But Maulana Hasrat Mohani imagines also in the early part of the 20th century, Asia as a new sphere of belonging. And of course, the defeat of Russia by Japan adds fuel to this idea of Asia as a new imagining. Maulana Zafar Ali Khan, editor of the Zamindar newspaper based out of Lahore, writes an entire opera called Marake Jang Russo Japan, Jang Russo Japan. And so Asia becomes yet another category, albeit briefly, that is flirted with, of course, as a unit through which a belligerent and imperial capitalistic West can be countered and can be fought against. But gradually what we see happening all the way up until the 90s, 30s and 40s is, of course, the Ghazal and the Ghazal Mushaira remains structurally intact. But the ways in which India could be thought of or conceived of became more and more restricted by political exigencies and by political ideas that were fundamentally rooted, of course, as I said earlier, in a material and in a physical, in physical markers, and to the point of course, India, the name India itself, in various languages being contested. So the idea of Hindustan or Hind versus Bharat, for instance, and the debates that begin to take place, juxtaposing Bharat, which is of course assumed to be a Hindu word for India, which Muslims refuse to use, and then Hindustan or Hind, which Muslims prefer to use. And again, these are debates that are still happening to this day. I think, what we find is that it is perhaps in capturing and being able to have the freedom to articulate an idea of India that is not constricted by these material, these physical constraints of geography and of a language that emerges from a modern political community, and this older form of belonging, of a spiritual, of a metaphysical belonging, in which perhaps there lies scope for articulating and reclaiming a sense of belonging and a sense of rootedness in India. I think lastly, what I would say is a lot of these questions of belonging, of course, and of Muslim belonging in India, as I said, my work is constrained to a particular area and of course a particular group of people. But I think by exploring the poetry, the space of the Mushaira, but also the poetry of people like Altaf Hussain Hadi, Muhammad Hussain Azad, Shibli Nomani, Hasrat Mohani, Akbar Allahabadi. I'm just reciting these names because some of you might be familiar with them. Dagh Dehlavi, Akbar Allahabadi, Ismail Merathi. My own grandfather, as it happens, who used the pen name Mehboob and Beher, my great grandfather also, who also grappled with these ideas of how to articulate a sense of belonging given this new vocabulary, this new political vocabulary. What I find is that in the absence of the nation state, there was room for these different sets of identities to reinforce each other and to not be contradictory. But of course, once the nation state is developed, the very impulse of of nationalism that every nation state sort of tends to generate is to sort of iron out the differences and this is what we are seeing today. There's a contest over how to define India and the freedom to define India as one wants. And I think, a very telling tale lies in the history of the national anthems and the national songs of the subcontinent. Allama Iqbal writes the Tarane Milli, which is sung in Pakistan, but he also writes the Tarane Hind, right? Which was until a few years ago known by most children, Hindustani-speaking children in North India. Rabindranath Tagore's is the author of the Bangladeshi national anthem as well as the Indian national anthem. And of course there's a debate, but apparently Jagannath Azad, a Hindu, was the original composer of the Pakistani national anthem until it was subsequently replaced by one written by Hafiz Jalandhari. So these, literature in a sense and the archive of poetry open up the possibilities of imagining and reimagining politics and a political space which is not binary, which is not black and white, which evades the structural kind of straitjackets that the nation state seeks to impose on its citizens. And in that way, the Mushaira to this day is something which as a form exists in Riyadh and is, as you said, someone said, in South Africa, in Dallas, in Dubai, and people from Pakistan and India come together at these events. And interestingly, and this is the last thing I'll say, the Shankar Shad Mushaira, which was also known as the Indo-Pak Mushaira, used to happen in Delhi every year. It was patronized by the DCM family, the Bharat Ram family, who are, of course, used to own cotton mills in what was previously Lailpur and now Faisalabad in Pakistan. And pre-1947, they used to patronize mushairas there, of which there are accounts in my, and they used to invite their workers and give them a holiday and so on. And then post 47, they held these Indo-Pak mushairas, in which in Delhi often Pakistani poets would be called. And it is only a few years ago, I believe 2017, or perhaps I'm getting the date wrong, but nonetheless in the last few years, that those mushairas completely stopped for various political reasons. So the mushaira, in a sense, even in post-partition India, continued actually to be one of those non-political, non-diplomatic spaces where people were in dialogue with each other. They were speaking to each other. And therefore, within the mushaira and within poetry lay the creative possibilities of articulating ideas of selfhoods that were not constricted by the exigencies of nationalism and a teleological kind of form of history that the nation state seeks to impose onto communities, but rather poetry, because of its inbuilt ambiguity, but also, and particularly in the Urdu tradition, but also poetry because of the Urdu language, which itself, in a sense, is at home nowhere, creates sort of an endless amount of possibilities of resisting, the pressures of a homogenizing nation state. Thank you so much. I'm sorry, I said I'd only speak 30 minutes, but I think it's been 40. So at least I'm within that upper limit. So my apologies.
No.
But,
Thanks a lot. Thank you so much, Ali. That was undeniably, I must say, a tour de force on the mushaira, or the episteme of the mushaira itself, and its history. Wonderful. I mean, I wish you had spoken for some more time, and I wish I had more time to engage with you in a conversation on some of the interesting facts and facets of Indian history that you narrated.